We often imagine judgment coming from a throne in the clouds, a distant gavel strike that shatters the world from a safe remove. But the terrifying reality of the ancient texts is that the divine did not always watch from above. Sometimes it walked among us. It breathed our air, sat at our tables, and looked us in the eye before deciding whether we deserved to exist. This is not just a story of fire and brimstone. It is a chronicle of a terrifying proximity between the Creator and the created, a moment where the line between the dust of the earth and the fire of heaven vanished entirely. And it begins not with a scream, but with a silence in the heat of the day, under the great trees of Mamre. It was shortly after the covenant was made between Abraham and God that the narrative shifts from the ethereal to the visceral. Genesis 18 tells us that the Lord visited Abraham in person, manifesting in the form of 3 men standing near his home. Picture the scene. The heat is oppressive, the air shimmering with the haze of the midday sun, and Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent, likely weary from the years that have piled upon him. But then he looks up. Upon seeing these 3 men, something primal and immediate triggers within him. It would appear that Abraham recognized these 3 men not merely as travelers, but as a physical manifestation of God himself. There is no hesitation, no questioning of their credentials. The text describes an urgency that defies his age. He eagerly rushed out of his tent to greet them, a movement that speaks of a desperate, terrified reverence. He told the men, whom he interpreted as God, that he wished to offer them hospitality, begging to wash their feet and provide them with something to eat so that they might be refreshed before resuming their journey. This act of washing feet was not just a custom. It was a grounding ritual, washing the dust of the world off the feet of the divine, a collision of the sacred and the profane in the most intimate of ways. The men, or God, agreed to this service, and Abraham hurried to his wife Sarah with a frantic energy, instructing her to make his Lord some food. The 3 men never actually introduced themselves as God, but it seems Abraham possessed some higher understanding as to who they were, hence why he goes out of his way to cater to these strangers, an act of service that wasn't particularly common at the time for random passers-by. In some interpretations, these 3 men are actually angels sent by God, or perhaps 2 are angels and 1 is God himself, an ambiguity that adds to the mysterious dread of the encounter. While they ate the meal prepared by a man who was dust and ashes, they began to speak of the future. The 3 men appeared to confirm Abraham's theory of their divinity, for they spoke of Sarah, declaring that by next year she would deliver Abraham a son. It is understood here that God, through these men, was reinforcing his promise, going as far as to give Abraham a specific time frame, a welcome gesture for a man who had waited most of his life for this moment. But within the tent, hidden from sight but not from hearing, was Sarah. An interesting tidbit that is often overlooked in the Bible is Sarah's reaction to hearing that she would give birth next year. She was a woman long past the age of childbearing, her body worn by time and disappointment. Sarah does not respond with the same elated joy that Abraham might have. Instead, she appears almost cynical. She whispers to herself, asking if she, now worn out and with a Lord who is old, will really have this pleasure. The Bible describes her as laughing as she says this, perhaps not convinced about the Lord's promises, and probably not in the right mood to bear a child, considering she was like 100 years old. If anything, the promise of having a child wasn't just ludicrous to Sarah, it was probably inconvenient too, and so she can be forgiven for that bitter, quiet laugh. But nothing is hidden from these guests. God doesn't think the laughter is forgivable or trivial. He asks Abraham, piercing through the tent walls with his knowledge, "Why did Sarah laugh?" He challenges them, asking if she really believed he would come to promise something he could not deliver on, even if it sounded impossible. He reiterates, before Abraham can even answer, that he will return in a year and that Sarah will indeed have a son. Sarah, who overhears God's questioning of Abraham regarding her laughter, responds in pure fear. The realization of who is sitting outside her tent crashes down on her. She is so afraid that God would do something drastic that she lies, telling him, "I did not laugh." And God, rather ominously and with a finality that chills the blood, replies simply, "Yes, you did." There is no argument, no debate. The truth is laid bare, and the power dynamic is set. The three men then decided to take their leave, heading toward a destination that would soon become synonymous with absolute destruction: Sodom. Abraham decided to walk with them, acting as an escort to the divine executioners. Then, quite interestingly, God has a little bit of a deliberation with himself. The Bible tells us that the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" Never before has God appeared to deliberate on what it is he wants to do. Usually, he simply just does it. But here, some might say there is hesitancy, as he appears to consult us, the reader. Or perhaps he is merely sharing his thoughts. It might be said that because God would make Abraham a great and mighty nation, and because Abraham was to be a great leader, God determined here that showing Abraham what he would soon do to Sodom and Gomorrah was necessary to prepare him for the heavy burdens of such leadership. God then reveals the terrible purpose of his visit. He tells Abraham that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sins so grievous that he will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached him. If not, he will know. Here we learn that the offenses committed by these cities are so great that it warrants a personal visit from God. It can be gathered that God had heard from multiple sources as to what was going on, and that the news disturbed him greatly. As God declares that he will go down and see for himself, it isn't necessarily because he doesn't already know, but more so to demonstrate how thorough he is when it comes to delivering such extremities. Basically, before he nukes the city, he makes sure they have violated his rules. The stage is set for a confrontation, not just between God and a city, but between God and his own servant, as Abraham realizes that the smoke of destruction is about to rise, and he decides to stand in its way. The three men, or three angels, made their way away from the tents of Mamre and toward the doomed valley of Sodom. But Abraham did not turn back to the safety of his home. Instead, he remained standing before the Lord, and what followed was one of the most audacious confrontations in religious history. Abraham proceeded to challenge God's plan and his integrity, essentially putting the Creator on trial for the sake of a city that he knew was wicked. He looked at the Almighty and asked a question that echoes through the ages. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? It was a gamble of cosmic proportions, a man of dust demanding that the judge of all the earth do right, arguing that the few good souls should not be punished for the sins of the whole nation. Abraham was not just asking for mercy, He was reminding God of his own nature, asserting that a pure judge is incapable of making an unjust decision. He starts high, asking if there are 50 righteous people in the city. Will God really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of those 50? And remarkably, God humors him. The Lord replies that if he finds 50 righteous people in Sodom, he will spare the whole place. But Abraham, described in this moment as a swindler and a smooth talker, realizes that 50 is perhaps too optimistic for a place like Sodom. So he begins to barter. He pushes his luck, asking God to reduce the number to 45, then 40, then 30, wearing down the divine wrath with sheer persistence. In the end, Abraham works God down to a mere 10 people. You might see this as Abraham being an excellent negotiator, a man capable of convincing God to change his mind. Or perhaps it reveals that God never really wanted to destroy the cities, and was looking for any excuse to spare the lives of the innocent. It is also possible that God was testing Abraham's capacity for leadership, seeing if he had the bones to intercede on behalf of others, a trait necessary for the father of nations. Yet there is a darker implication here. God likely already knew there weren't going to be 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. His acquiescence wasn't a submission to Abraham's logic, but a grim confirmation that the city was irredeemable. God was going to do what he wanted anyway, because the math of righteousness would never add up in Sodom. The perspective of the story then shifts violently from the quiet desert negotiation to the bustling, sin-laden gateway of the city itself. It is evening now, and Lot, Abraham's nephew, is sitting in the gateway of Sodom when he sees 2 angels approaching. These were likely 2 of the men Abraham had just fed, now walking into the heart of darkness. Lot, living in the city, seems to possess the same spiritual sight as his uncle. He recognizes the men for their divineness immediately. It is unknown if they had wings spanning out of their backs, but if they did, they would have been conspicuous targets. It is more likely they hid their wings but could not hide their distinguished aura. Lot is struck by them, terrified perhaps by the contrast of their purity against the filth of his city, and he bows with his face low to the ground. He begs them, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house," urging them to wash their feet and spend the night before leaving early in the morning. But the angels decline. They tell him, "No, we will spend the night in the square." This refusal might have been a test or simple indifference, but Lot knew the reality of Sodom better than anyone. He insisted upon them so strongly that they eventually agreed, likely because Lot's persistence was born of fear for their safety. He knew the men of this city. He knew that 2 handsome celestial strangers sleeping in the open square would not see the morning light. He practically drags them to the safety of his home, preparing a meal and hoping to hide them from the prying eyes of the town. But secrets in Sodom do not last long. Word of the 2 handsome visitors spread through the streets like a virus, and before the angels could retire to bed, the house was besieged. The Bible paints a scene of absolute horror, telling us that all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house. This wasn't a small gang of criminals. It was the entire male population, a generational rot that spanned from the elderly to the youth. They called out to Lot with a singular, depraved demand. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." The text is explicit. The men of Sodom have gathered not to greet the visitors, but to assault them. They demonstrate a total disregard for the sacred principles of hospitality and morality, driven only by a gluttonous need to be sexually satisfied. They don't care who the visitors are, or that the act would be non-consensual. The only thing stopping them is the wooden door of Lot's house. In a moment of desperation that reveals just how twisted the moral compass of the region had become, Lot steps out to reason with the mob. He attempts to dissuade them, calling them "my friends" and begging them not to do this wicked thing. But his method of bargaining is arguably just as horrific as the mob's intent. Lot offers up his 2 virgin daughters to the crowd instead. He tells the mob, "Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them." This is a shocking, sickening low point for Lot, a man who appears to play God by trading the innocence of his own children to save 2 strangers he barely knows. Perhaps in the twisted hierarchy of the time, the sacred obligation of hospitality to guests outranked the safety of one's own family. But to the modern ear, and likely to the angels watching, it was a moment of supreme failure. But the mob was beyond reason and beyond bargaining. They didn't want the daughters. They wanted the angels. And they were done talking. They sneered at Lot. This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. They threatened to treat him worse than the visitors, and the sea of bodies surged forward to break down the door. But the violence that was about to consume Lot was halted not by a weapon, but by a terrifying display of celestial power. Just as the mob pressed against the wood, threatening to tear the house apart, the angels reached out from the darkness of the doorway. They pulled Lot back inside, and in an instant struck the frenzied crowd with blindness. This was not merely the extinguishing of lights. It was a sensory severance. The Bible tells us that the men, both young and old, were suddenly plunging into a chaotic void, groping for a door they could no longer perceive. Their lust turned instantly into confusion and panic. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted from siege to judgment. The angels turned to Lot, their disguises as mere travelers now irrelevant, and issued a command that signaled the end of the world as he knew it. They asked if he had anyone else in the city, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, and ordered him to get them out immediately, because the Lord had sent them to destroy the place. The outcry against the city had reached its breaking point, and the time for investigation was over. The execution had begun. Lot, now fully grasping the gravity of the situation, rushed out into the night to find the men pledged to marry his daughters. Imagine the desperation in his voice as he pounded on their doors, breathless and frantic, telling them to get up and leave because the Lord was about to destroy the city. But to his sons-in-law, he looked like a madman. The city was asleep, the danger unseen, and Lot's apocalyptic warnings sounded like a bad joke. To their detriment, they thought he was joking and dismissed him, choosing to stay in the comfort of their beds rather than face the unknown terror he described. As the night bled into morning, the tragedy of their disbelief was sealed. When dawn broke, the angels were no longer asking, they were commanding. They urged Lot to hurry, to take his wife and 2 daughters and flee before the punishment of the city swept them away. Yet, in a deeply human moment of paralysis, Lot hesitated. Perhaps he was looking back at the life he had built, the wealth he had accumulated. Or perhaps he was paralyzed by the sheer scale of the threat. The Bible states that when he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters. It implies a use of force. The angels did not wait for his permission. They physically dragged him and his family out of the city, leading them to safety, not because Lot was brave, but because the Lord was merciful to them. Once they were clear of the city walls, the instruction was simple and terrifying. Flee for your lives. Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away. But even here, with the smell of sulfur already perhaps tainting the air, Lot tried to bargain. He told the angels he could not make it to the mountains, fearing the disaster would overtake him there. He pointed to a small town nearby, later known as Zoar, and begged to flee there instead, arguing that it was such a small place that surely it could be spared. In a final act of grace, the angels agreed, telling him to flee there quickly because they could do nothing until he arrived. Then the sun rose over the land, and the sky tore open. The Bible describes the destruction with a horrifying specificity. The Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, out of the heavens from the Lord. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a divine bombardment. The text describes the overthrowing of the cities, the entire plain, and every living thing, including the vegetation. From a distance, Abraham looked out toward the plain and saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a giant furnace, a grim confirmation that the 10 righteous men had never been found. But amidst this fiery annihilation, a singular, tragic figure emerged. Lot's wife, running behind him, disobeyed the one specific command the angels had given. She looked back. In that moment of disobedience, curiosity, or perhaps heartbreaking sympathy for the dying city, she was frozen in time, transformed instantly into a pillar of salt. Some say she looked back because she longed for her old life. Others say she was simply too attached to the world she was leaving behind. Regardless of the reason, her statue became a permanent monument to the cost of hesitation. The sons born from this incestuous union, Moab and Ben-Ami, would go on to father the Moabites and Ammonites, nations that would become bitter enemies of Israel. The story that began with a promise of a son to Abraham ends with the birth of sons through deception and sin, a dark, ironic twist that leaves the reader staring into the shadows of the human heart. Here is the terrifying paradox that lies buried in the ashes of the plain. We read this story and convince ourselves that it is a tale of divine cleansing, a moment where God burned the infection out of the world. But look closer at the survivor. Lot, the man labeled righteous enough to be saved, is the same man who offered his own daughters to a mob and later fathered children with them in a drunken stupor. The irony is shattering. God rained fire from the heavens to destroy the wickedness of Sodom. Yet the seed of that wickedness walked right out the front gate, protected by the very hand of an angel. The fire incinerated the stone and the flesh, but it failed to burn the corruption out of the human heart. It proves that you can nuke the city, but you cannot nuke the nature of man. We do this every day. We treat our lives like Sodom, believing that if we just change our environment, If we quit that job, end that relationship, or move to a new city, we will leave our demons behind. We think we can run from our problems, but like Lot, you bring your shadow with you. The chaos isn't in the burning city you are leaving. It is in the suitcase you are packing. You can outrun the sulfur, you can escape the valley, but you can never outrun yourself. The cave you hide in will eventually become just as dark as the city you fled. So when the sky turns red, and the time comes to leave your old life behind, which fatal flaw will you choose? Do you look back like Lot's wife, paralyzed by your love for a toxic past? Or do you run forward like Lot, carrying your corruption into the future? The choice is yours. The smoke of Sodom has finally cleared, but the greatest test of Abraham's life is still to come. If you think the sacrifice of a city was heavy, wait until you see what God asks of a father on Mount Moriah. Subscribe now to witness the sacrifice, because the fire is far from out.